In Insomniac's Spider-Man 2, one of the main characters, Miles Morales, has a love interest called Hailey Cooper, who is deaf. Spider-Man 2 is an open-world, story-based game with 13 side missions. In one optional side mission, Graffiti Trouble, you play as Hailey. During this mission, the audio is muted to simulate hearing loss. Hailey and this side mission is a clear attempt to induce empathy in able-bodied players. Obviously, representation is important within video games and can be a powerful tool for inducing empathy for the victims of real oppression. However, for representation to be authentic, it needs to explore the real struggles of oppressed people. In this specific example, the inclusion of Hailey, and specifically this side quest where you play as Hailey, falls short of depicting the real struggles of deaf people. So, let's look at Hailey within the context of the game, as the gameplay itself can be considered infantilizing. What I mean by this is that emojis appear above her head depicting her feelings, rather than an internal monologue the other playable characters have. This separates Hailey from the other playable characters and removes agency from her, as she is not offered the same nuances as the other characters get in their internal dialogue. Additionally, Spider-Man 2 promises an exciting new adventure with focus on fighting mechanics and a fast-paced story. The gameplay in Graffiti Trouble is a slow-paced minigame, which doesn't offer Hailey much agency. It also is pretty boring. But this lack of agency means that Hailey doesn't have much to do with the main story of the game and keeps her away from the main fight, which could give the idea that she is less capable than the other characters. This, coupled with the infantilization and the othering of the character, fails to evoke empathy and can have a damaging effect on the deaf community as a whole. In the case of Graffiti Trouble, the player spends about 10 minutes as Hailey. This short amount of time cannot show what it's like to live with a disability your whole life. Even if this was a deliberate attempt by Insomniac to induce empathy, can this really be achieved in this small amount of time, in what is a skippable, slow side mission in a much larger game? The minigame itself requires the player to walk slowly through 3 different locations and complete a minigame that involves simple tasks such as moving the joystick into a circle, and of course, shaking the controller. The main issue with this is that it does not create a very interesting mission, and there is nothing interesting happening on screen. This being a side mission means it doesn't advance the main plot of the story. This sets the mission apart from the other 13 side missions of the game. You may be thinking, sure, it doesn't advance the story, but the point of a side mission is to have missions within the game that shows sort of the lived-in experience or adds a little bit of extra fun for the players to complete. You know, these optional side missions are usually there to create a more interesting and lived-in game, and then maybe add a little bit more context about what's happening in the world, or just a fun little gameplay feature, or maybe some bad guys to beat up, something like that. But this side mission is actually set apart from the other 13 side missions that are in the game, as many of these side missions include some level of high-paced Spider-Man action, or enhance the plot in some kind of meaningful way. Even if they don't forward the plot, they do add some needed context around the plot and stuff like that. The side missions in Spider-Man 2 are actually split up into 4 different categories, with Graffiti Trouble falling into the FNSM app request, which simulates an app that you can send requests in for Spider-Man to go help them. In this category, there are 6 different side missions, meaning this category takes up the majority of the side missions. All of these side missions, apart from Graffiti Trouble, induce some sort of depiction of fighting, action, or add to the main plot of the game in a meaningful way. To be clear, I'm specifically talking about the FNSM app request side missions, not other side missions such as the Brooklyn Academy side missions. Those have their own problems. I'm sure you're probably thinking of the other side mission, maybe kind of problematic side mission in that category. I'll make a separate video about that if people want to see that. The lack of fighting, or any action really, adds to the infantilization of the character, as she is almost treated as more frail or less capable than the other characters. This is not because she's not a superhero. There are missions in the game where you play as MJ, Peter Parker's love interest, where she's in the action with the 2 Spider-Men, or you have to complete a stealth mission. Now, these side missions also are not perfect and have received a lot of criticism, but they are a much needed improvement from MJ's side missions in the first game. The important thing is that MJ is a non-superpowered human who is given more to do and is way more involved with the main story than Hayley is. This sets Hayley apart from all the other characters. This is important because when you play as Hayley, the player is using less complex game mechanic than they would in a fighting mission. Because this is Hayley's one and only side mission in this game, it is the only side mission where you actually play as a disabled person. Therefore, the mechanics of this mission can drastically affect how able-bodied players view living with a disability. Please ignore the mispronunciation, as Stanzigil et al. Point out, disability mechanics in a game have a direct influence on the perception of the disability by able-bodied players. These mechanics are more simple than the rest of the game, which offers mechanics like a fighting system, which have over 47 different abilities, and many other combos and other forms of gameplay that are more involved and active than this. Because of the simplification of gameplay, it can give the impression that Hayley, and therefore real-life deaf people, are less capable than able-bodied people, which is damaging and potentially a dangerous and oversimplified representation of people within the deaf community. Additionally, as said before, Graffiti Trouble has little to do with the main plot. The plot of the side mission is that Hayley is helping out a struggling graffiti artist who is being a perfectionist, and she ends up crossing out her work. Hayley works to fix the poor graffiti by painting over it and tracking down the original artist to give them a pep talk over text, and then they work together to create a mural. This side mission has absolutely nothing to do with either of the Spider-Men or what they are currently doing. This is a big contrast to the other side missions in the FNSM app request category, such as the mission Find Grandpa, which seems just as trivial as Graffiti Trouble on the surface, as the player is helping a woman track down her missing grandfather. But at the end of the mission, you sit down with the grandfather as he recounts the stories of his now deceased wife. This connects to the main story as Peter Parker is currently having relationship issues with MJ, and talking to the grandpa gives him a new perspective on his relationship. This is very important to the main story and actually adds depth to his relationship issues, and is especially interesting as MJ does later turn into a villain. Comparing this to Graffiti Trouble, it has nothing to offer the main story. It could be argued that it offers more characterization of Hayley, but nothing in this mission offers more nuance to her character, and everything we learn about her in this mission we had already known previously, such as her doing charity work and her being an artist. Even playing as her does not do much to further her as a character, because she is not afforded an inner dialogue like the other playable characters get. Instead of getting an inner dialogue, she gets little emojis above her head, which is so cool. And totally not incredibly infantilizing, because instead of knowing more about her thought process or her personality, like we do other characters, we instead get little drawings that do not depict anything nuanced about her. The fact Hayley does not have an internal dialogue was purposely done by the developers. The goal was to simulate some of the challenges that a person with no hearing faces, but her having her inner thoughts portrayed with simplified emojis can send the wrong message that deaf people have less complex thoughts or don't have the same sort of internal thinking as hearing people, which is obviously pretty problematic. A lot of this lack of gameplay and minimal effect on the story can be explained because this was one of the last side missions added into the game. The side mission was first proposed by Brittany Morris, an able-bodied writer at Insomniac, late into the game's development. Morris claims that in writing Hayley as a character, she is uplifting the stories and struggles of real-life deaf people by including them in a well-known franchise. She actually stated that when writing a character who doesn't share the writer's experiences, 80% of the work is listening. It is clear that the writers of Insomniac were trying to include the representation of deaf people, to share some of the struggles faced by deaf people and induce empathy. This is done well in some areas of the game, such as using ASL and text-to-speech to show some of the different ways deaf people communicate. However, the game itself was not fully accessible to deaf people on the game's release. When released, the game did not include a setting for captions of non-dialogue audio. This is a huge issue and may be off-putting for some deaf players, as the background audio, which is essential for some of the story or the side missions, is not accessible. This has since been updated since the game's release. However, this suggests that Hayley's addition was not intended to be a character that deaf players can relate to, but instead intended to induce empathy in non-deaf players. Additionally, again, sorry for the mispronunciation, so that Hayley experiences New York in a completely different way from our other characters. Her side story was clearly made to show New York through the eyes of a disabled person, but the side mission is confined to a small area that consists mostly of empty scaffolding. Furthermore, you only interact with 2 people, well, technically 3 if you count Spider-Man at the end, which doesn't exactly show the busy, bustling streets of New York. This suggests a further problem with disability simulators as a whole. Disability simulators are activities or games that attempt to simulate what it's like to live with a disability to able-bodied people. Silverman pointed out that although disability simulators are intended out of good faith to promote empathy, there is evidence to suggest that they actually do the opposite. Because disability simulators only last a couple of minutes, or in our case, about 10 minutes depending how quickly you play, it's hard to portray to an able-bodied person the full scope of what it means to be living with a disability. So even if the game is uplifting the stories of deaf people, it is hard to portray the full story of what it's like to live with deafness in such a short time. In fact, the only aspect of deafness the side quest seems to explore is what it's like to crawl over scaffolding and, of course, having emojis above your head. In Silverman's article, he refers to an experiment done that simulates blindness. In this experiment, people wore blindfolds and were asked to do basic tasks. After the experiment, people reported experiencing fear, frustration, and incompetence. These negative emotions were then applied to blind people as a whole. However, many people who experience blindness from the beginning of their lives do not feel the same fear, frustration, and incompetency that these people within the simulation felt. Although it is obviously very important to include representation of disabilities within games, having a side mission that serves as a disability simulator does not seem as an ideal way to do it, especially this mini-game based one, which could cause frustration within the players from its simplistic gameplay, or suggest to the players that deaf people are incompetent because Hayley is not allowed to participate more actively within the story. Therefore, by including this as a disability simulator, there is a major issue in the way that Spider-Man 2 attempts to induce empathy for people living with deafness. In conclusion, Spider-Man 2 is a game that attempts to induce empathy for the player, but it fails in many key ways, which could unfortunately lead to the opposite outcome. Its simplistic, infantilizing gameplay portrays Hayley as different from the other characters. This gameplay, which can be frustrating, serves as a disability simulator for what it's like to live with deafness, which can lead the player to believe that this is what it is like to live with this disability, causing a negative perception on Hayley and therefore the deaf community as a whole. Additionally, the simulation falls short of actually portraying what it's like to live with this disability, as Hayley is kept away from the other characters and not really given anything interesting to do in the plot, and is infantilized through the use of emojis. It is obviously so important to have disability representation in video games because it is so rare. But in trying to make an empathetic character, Insomniac failed to make an interesting one, or give her anything substantial to do, which just leaves her as an empty character and an infantilized version of a deaf person.